everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be just doing a little bit of something different. We're going to be talking about decks that I think that you should be playing if you want to climb at least efficiently. These aren't necessarily going to be the most fun decks because some of them are very repetitive, but the idea is to win on the ladder and get to a point where we can play kind of some other stuff we want. And I do kind of recommend that a bit if you get tired of climbing. If you hit plat 4, play whatever you want for a while and just take a break. When you hit diamond 4, play whatever you want for a while and just kind of take a break, or just play in the public play section if you really want, because once you hit that threshold of plat and diamond 4, you can't de-rank from there, so you can lose in the next 100 games if you really want to. So that's the time to try out other things if you want to, or whatnot. But we're going to just talk about the decks I would recommend if you're just strictly kind of climbing, and certain things will make sense as we get into it. So we'll start off with number 5. Starting in at number 5 here, I'm going to pick one of the decks that's weirdly off meta for anybody who plays best of 3. You're never going to see this in a best of 3 tournament or anything like that, because best of 1 is its very own unique play style, and that is auras. Mono white auras has a lot of value in it. As you can see, it's super low to the curve. It just reminds you of mono red and what it used to do back in the day, but it is sometimes susceptible to cards that can't be countered, or like nowhere to run is your biggest enemy in the world, because that gets around shelter by ghost and things like that, and your weaver, which are really strong. But cards with scavenger and weaver, along with about any of these auras, tend to do very well, and the game plan is pretty straightforward while just basically holding this up any chance you can. A lot of times you're going to start off with a scavenger, you're going to play a weaver. Scavenger is most likely going to get answered if you're playing against like in a higher tier, or oftentimes just, you know, we have to answer land war elves and all that type of stuff, so 1-drops don't typically make it too long. And then if you have a weaver and you just get to attach a shelter by ghost to it and hold up the rescue, or even get to a situation where you play another scavenger and then you shardless agent the weaver, then it's going to have ward 4, and it's also going to get an extra counter, and this only gives a 1-0, so it does have that 3 toughness, so do be careful if you are against a nowhere to run matchup, so they can answer that pretty cleanly. But this right here is just a combination that's going to be very difficult, and oftentimes your opponent will have to hold mana to try to answer this somehow. And if they can't and your second scavenger lives, then you just get to kind of run away with the game, and it's very quick and easy. However, one of the main things is sometimes without an ethereal armor, you're not fast enough to beat some of the other decks on this list, even though you've gained some life, even though you might just be able to take a Badgerimal Cub under this and things like that. But if you're allowed to have a second scavenger, they're allowed to have a second Badgerimal Cub, and they always have a second Cub, so it's always really hard there. But other than that, the deck archetype's just good. You have Graveyard Hate in the main, which is nice. No real crazy Graveyard Hate, because this does have to attack. And if you don't make it any bigger, it is susceptible to like every blocker they ever put in play. But the other problem with this is obviously cards like Arden can outvalue it and things like that as well, where you can only exile things so often. And Seam Rip becomes dead in some matchups, and that's our best removal to be playing in a deck like this. But we can also fly over, potentially put extra things on, and most helpful Weaver is a very strong card in that aspect. But we have a couple of other off-meta decks to talk about, and we'll get to that right now. Another off-meta deck, and honestly, this one's really weird, but I felt like I had to include it because I feel like I always see this having success, even though I just necessarily can't quite do it myself. It's just one of those weird ones where I see every time I kind of go against it, my opponent just picks me up, takes me outside, and sets me in the snow. It says, "Clean it up, young one." I don't get it. Like, it wins whenever I'm not playing it, and I hate saying that because it's like, well, get good, you know what I mean? But it's just one of those archetypes that maybe I just don't understand it. There's not even a protection spell in this one. I did grab this one from Untapped, so it was kind of whatever one was there. But if you don't know what the principle of this deck is, and the crafting guide is something I should have talked about in the last one, but this one's a bit more expensive, as you can see, but this deck makes up for that in its mana base for the most part, as you do have only 6 rares in your mana, which is pretty good, and Badgerimal Cub is one of the best cards in standard. It's so good, but it's just bad enough that I don't think it'll receive a ban unless people really start pulling up their pitchforks and things like that, which we'll see this card obviously later on the list, as you'll probably know. But there's not too much to really explain about this. You play lands and you win, right? So we play a Chocobo, we play a Mossborn Hydra, we play a lot of lands and we win. We use Earthbending's Ascension to get extra lands, but also to give our creatures trample, like the Chocobo that they've chump blocked a couple of turns. Now, maybe a 4-5 with trample with Earthbender, maybe a 7-8 with trample. It really accelerates pretty quickly. And something like Earthbender Ascension works incredibly well with like a Tifa Lockhart, because when you play a land, this triggers and the Earthbender's Ascension triggers at the same time. So you can actually put the counter on Tifa first and then double Tifa's power. So immediately you go from 2 to 4, and then say it's a fetch land, and maybe you fetch and then you put an additional counter on it. So then you go for a counter, so at 2, and then you go to 4, and then you put a counter going to 5, then it goes to 10. And that's not to count if you maybe have an Ice Till Explorer that you can play an extra one, or in situations where you have an Earthbender's Ascension online and maybe play a second one. So then you would play a second one, you would get a land, they would trigger twice, and then you could just put 2 more counters on it, put into 12, and then that jumps up to 24. That also gets exponentially higher if you have like a Bristly Bill. So if we just kind of have one of these little combinations of Fable Passage and these, you play Passage, 2 counters on the Tifa, it goes to 3, then jumps to 6, and then you fetch, put 2 more counters, putting it at 8, and then it jumps to 16, which is very good for just 2 lands, like very aggressive at that, unless I'm doing my math wrong for some reason. I don't think so, but either way, very good value. And then you have cards like Badgerimal Cub that just become a problem and help you get a lot of mana. And then if you have a Traveling Chocobo, obviously this gets insanely crazy on the stack. I haven't really played this deck all too much because I just tend to find myself not winning with it, so I don't like to really show it off too much. But every time I pull up Untapped, somebody's in Mythic playing it, somebody's doing well, has a good win percentage, and it just seems to always be at that 55 to 57% win rate, and it just is what it is. So with that, we'll move on to the final list. So here is the final one that I had success with, but this is kind of a creative angle that I want to show. So this is a Mythic Mike list where we made a few changes. We talked about it in the video where we added Nowhere to Run. Other than that, it's the exact carbon copy of the deck. But this is what I mean by off meta. Moonshadow is another card that kind of gets this treatment of an off meta deck. And that is because decks like Control cannot prepare for you, because they have to prepare for Badgerimal Cub and graveyard shenanigans. Even though we do tend to be a graveyard deck, if Rest in Peace is able to beat us and they don't necessarily get to board wipe us, then that's got other problems in it as well. Moonshadow is obviously in this deck, which is pretty sweet. But we have a lot of play with this, and that's why this deck forms so well. But we can very easily queue up into a match that just beats us as well. And it's kind of hard to break all those down. But the thing that you have to look out for if you are playing some off meta stuff is you have to be able to do what you're doing incredibly well. And what this deck does incredibly well is if we play a Moonshadow, we are pretty much getting all these counters off by turn 4 at the latest most of the time. Oftentimes we can do it with turn 3 with something like an Iron Shield Elf. So that just makes this a giant 7/7. And with that, we're also discarding a Bloodghast or a Timeline Caller, which puts a ton of pressure in, and then Corpse of the Lost can finish the job while also playing a slew of removal, which oftentimes isn't really possible in these decks, but because they work with Moonshadow and we have Surveils from the Gorehound and a card like Forsaken Miner that we want to commit crimes with, it actually ends up being okay to play this much removal, which is typically not a great thing to be doing whenever you're doing this, because you want to be all in on something. Mono White is kind of a good example of that, where they really play 8 removal spells, but 1 is because Shelter by Ghost, oftentimes, even if not a removal spell, the life gain is incredibly good. But here it's just so off meta that it's nice. But we also have a backup plan against board wipes, which is typically a creature nightmare. 1 Iron Shield can discard, giving itself indestructible, and 3 damage is no joke. Ask people back in Throne of Eldraine how good Brazen Borrower was, because you would just bounce a thing and then you would flash it in, and just for the next 4 turns you would hit them for 3 because they never wanted to tap out, and you would just win with that. But Iron Shield kind of has that same flavor to it, so your opponent then on your turn has to try to burn this, so you tap it and you don't hit them with it and you go down on cards. But what happens there, say your opponent hits this because you're trying to go to combat or something, and you just play a land and you bring back a Bloodghast. That has haste because you've gotten them below 10 because of the pressure that you made earlier, off of maybe something like a timeline caller where it has haste because we either warp it and then we play it from the warp zone, and then we also have Corpse of the Lost, which can then make a hasty skeleton creature that's a 3/2. If you play a second one, now they're 4/2s. If you get a creature that hits the graveyard, Corpse of the Lost triggers, you put it back in your hand, you replay it. So this is just one of those decks, and it just works, right? So this is probably one of the better examples of an off-meta deck that works very, very well. Obviously, I wish I had my own over here, but this was one of the better examples that I could give of someone who does play a lot of off-meta stuff and has pretty great success with it. So with that, we're going to move into slot number 4. So here we are, and this is probably going to be one of the more controversial takes I have on this video, and I am putting Izzet Lessons, the second best of 3 deck and one of the stronger decks in the meta, weirdly in 4th place. One, it gets the kind of tax of, hey, I'm one of the best decks, you better prep for me. So decks do that. One, also graveyard hate can kind of passively hit this in best of 1, as well as just knowing the deck a bit more. I think people are a lot more comfortable with dealing with the matchup, whereas before, you know, Artist Talent, you've never countered Artist Talent ever, right? But now you have to. We know Idle Quenches, like a few of the spell snares are nice, and Grand has to go, right? So it's just one of those things where obviously knowledge of the deck has made this deck kind of fall back. But one of the things that you'll kind of struggle with when running this is sometimes in best of 1, if you don't really get the accumulative wisdom online, it feels like your opponent runs out of stuff to do. And the way this one's built, based on kind of what I found on Goldfish, the most recent list, I think. Yeah, this took 1st place in an RCQ and SCG. And then if it tells you anything, in the big SCG event, so Star City Games, if you don't know what I'm referring to, Izzet Lessons didn't make top 8 in best of 3, where you can argue it's even a little bit better than it is in best of 1, in my opinion. It's just kind of an annoying deck to play against on Arena, and it's also kind of an annoying deck to play in general. One, because if your opponent's holding priority at any point because it's some random card, like obviously your opponent's allowed to hold priority, especially if they have some random thing where they want to blow up your monument or something weird like that, or they want to flash in a flanker to exile your stuff in response to a wisdom. Well, they have to hold the priority, and Arena is going to ask them every time, and then it's going to slow down your matches, and you're going to find yourself very often just waiting for the stack to resolve, and it just kind of sucks. In general, it's just like, oh, I'll cast this thing. Okay, trigger my Artist Talent. Okay, discard a card. Trigger my Monument. Okay, what mode do I want to click? Okay, I'll click this one. All right, Monument does the mode. Okay, cool. Cast another spell. Trigger my Artist Talent. Discard a card. Trigger my Monument. I guess I'll draw a card. Sweet. Remove the thing. Cast Accumulative Wisdom. Trigger Artist Talent. It's just, you just do it every time, and then every time you do it, you're probably going to see Artist Talent go on the stack like 5 times every single turn, your turn and your opponent's. It can be very, very frustrating to play, and it feels like it's just taking you forever to get through it, and the motion is just kind of rinse and repeat. Obviously, some people love this type of thing. It's not really my cup of tea whenever it comes to playing like an Izzet deck. I really enjoy the Prowess variations myself because I think those are a little bit more fun, a little bit more explosive when it comes to like, oh, do you answer this? No. Okay, you lose. Nice. Great. But this deck, I feel like a lot of people know. I put it in 4th just because, one, it kind of sucks to play. Your opponents are going to salt off a lot of times because your opponents are just going to leave, so you're stuck there. And then also, if they're holding priority, it makes it really hard to get through your turns. And it's just like, on Arena's client alone, and it's not really anything Arena can do about it. It just is what it is. It's just kind of hard to get through the game, right? And same with what MTGO is, at least in my experience. Other people don't really bother them, whatever. But for me, I put this at 4. Okay, so I realized I'm probably going to get cooked for these takes, and I just realized my lightning strikes aren't even the same, dude. Who let me out of the house? But there's going to be a reason that I put this here, and this is going to be the 3rd list, I would say, that I would probably recommend for climbing. And it comes down to a couple of reasons. One, I understand Izzet Lessons is a cheap deck to craft, but this deck is also cheap and just crushes Lessons. So it's kind of weird to have a deck side by side to each other when one typically, in my opinion, I feel like beats them a lot. And that's thanks to the Scalding Viper and the Razorkin Needlehead. These both are like, if your opponent casts a spell with mana value 3 or less, you deal a damage. If they draw an extra card, you deal a damage, right? And it just adds up over time, especially if they're not able to answer the higher claw right away. And even if they do, you obviously have more, and then you also have burn. So then it just gets this really taxing type of effect in play, and then something like an Osier can come in and finish the job. So it's a very weird deck to have to play against if you are Lessons, and it does have enough removal if you are playing Badgerimal Cub, which is kind of a scarier deck to play against if you are the mono red, because sometimes Badgerimal Cub will get way ahead of you. That's why we are residing in third here. But mono red, no matter what you do, is probably going to be at some point in the meta, right? It just doesn't matter. It always shows up. It's actually, this deck's not that cheap. Now I look at it, a lot of rares from on a red deck. Now I'm here, right? Like, this is so many rares, but higher claws, if you're playing any type of aggro, you definitely have these. You probably have these because it makes sense to have these. Light Shatter, you would have this one. I could see people maybe not having. I would assume people have this. The links, you could probably just cut, especially in best of one. There's a lot of options over here that you could play in the best of 3 kind of variation of it. But Razorkin maybe not have. The links you could cut, and then the Hexing Squelchers, kind of whatever. These are obviously situations where maybe if you have a second Squelcher and you don't want to play the links, play that instead. It's obviously kind of, you know, build your own deck sometime, you know? Like, if you think a card's great and another card's bad right now in the meta, then switch it, right? Like, that's what we were talking about with the off-meta stuff, right? Getting to call your shot and then kind of sticking to it and working through it and becoming really good at it. But mono red is just always kind of going to be good, and especially with the hand smoother and best of one, it's always kind of going to have an explosive hand. And if your opponent can't really stop you, there's not a lot they can do, and your matches are fast. This kind of has the other problem that are, I guess this doesn't have the other problem that kind of the Izzet Lessons deck does, and the fact that it just does its thing really quick, right? Like, you, every time you put a spell in a stack, it's resolving, it's done. These triggers happen on their upkeep, it resolves, it's done, right? Like, you just aren't doing anything. When you attack, this is doing a damage to them. They're not really going to do much about it. It's fine. And this deck just, not even this one in general, just mono red in general, does really well. I thought about putting the mono white deck here, but the mono white deck just tends to, I don't know. I feel like I either get crushed by the mono white deck or I crush it. And mono red, it always feels like if I win, it's kind of an escape. Or like I will crush it every now and then, but it always feels like I'm within range with mono red. This also is, obviously this is the variation I got from kind of Goldfish from a best of 3 list, so I kind of brought the whole thing. But obviously, you know, there's other variations of red that I kind of want to talk about, and I'm not just meaning this one. There is the firebending. So this is kind of why it's nice to talk about it. Slick shot, obviously. And then what's the card? The easiest to do this? Yeah. So not necessarily even the fact that I want to talk about just mono red. The thing about red is you still even have to worry about this variation of it, where you just move all these aside, where you have to worry about this one, where they might play a firebending student and then they give it +3, which puts it at 5, and then they attack, and then they cast lightning strike, burst lightning, or something like that. And at the end of all that, they fling it at you, right? They just cast a couple spells on firebending student, hit you for 8, and then fling it at you, right? Like, it's just so hard to play against this variation, and then you play against this variation, and then you play against this one first, and then you're like, okay, they played a higher claw, sure. And then they plot a slick shot, and you're like, oh no. And then they hasten Emberheart Challenger with a slick shot, and then they do a lot of other things, right? So mono red unlike mono white, which is like, as soon as I see that it's mono white, I can tell you the exact 60 that they're probably playing, minus maybe 3 cards that they might have changed, right? Mono red, if your opponent says Mountain Hired Claw, you're like, what version are they playing? And then randomly they play a swamp and they're just playing lizards, and you're just like, what happened here? They play a Gav, and then you're like really confused, even though I don't think lizards is necessarily going to be the 3rd best deck at climbing. I'm just saying the openness that red has in terms of variations of decks it's playing, and you'll see one deck kind of on this list. The next 2, you'll see kind of why I'm putting red here. It's just, there's so much stuff you have to worry about with this deck, and you oftentimes always feel like, well, they have 5 mana, so if they top deck a Hellkite, I lose. If they top deck a Burst Lightning, they hit me for 4, I lose. Oh, well, they have 1 spell in hand and 3 lands in play. If they Slick Shot, cast a Burst Lightning, that hits me for 5 and I die. Like, you're just oftentimes in that spot, and you have to escape that turn, and then you feel comfortable and win pretty easily. But if you can't get past that turn, you just end up folding and dying. So mono red is going to take the 3rd spot, but it's not just this list. It's mono red variations in general that you should be looking to play always, because mono red is kind of always just good, especially in best of 1. So with that, we're going to move on to the second list. Okay, so for the second list, as you see, is a Simic Ouroboros, but I don't want you to narrow your sight to just Simic. Basically, if you are playing Landwar Elves, Badgerimal Cub, Ouroboros, you're probably doing pretty well for yourself. This is just such a strong foundation. Lol, W, haha. But basically, what you're getting to do is you're getting to play turn 1 Landwar Elves, turn 2 Badgerimal Cub, have 2 mana, cast any other 2 mana spell at random. And then on turn 3, you either play Ouroboros while also casting other stuff, or you Nature's Rhythm for another Badgerimal Cub. Now your stuff makes 3 mana, and now you play another thing, and then you bounce off a creature, right? So it just becomes a super explosive deck, and Simic tends to be the most common, but there are obviously like 4-color variations. There's other kind of Badgerimal Cub decks that lead with Ouroboros, but this is going to feel a bit like cheating. But I think if you're playing a deck with this foundation of Landwar Elves, Badgerimal Cub, Ouroboros, you're probably playing the second best type of deck to be playing. The issue that comes with it is a deck like this, in my opinion, needs a lot of reps to play incredibly well. Because sometimes, I know it sounds weird, playing the Badgerimal Cub on turn 2 is actually not the play. And understanding that is very hard. And some people are like, well, why wouldn't it be the play? 1, it can just get answered, and now you have a land and a creature land, and if you don't have like a Badgerimal Cub to back it up, now your land's susceptible to getting like hit with a removal spell on your upkeep, and then it comes back tapped, and now your mana is really awkward, things like that. The other thing too, for example, there's a deck that kind of hunts this deck, or at least Badgerimal Cub, and that's the Dragons deck, weirdly. Clarion Conquer doesn't let that creature tap for a mana. You could be walking into setting your mana back a turn. However, sometimes I have personally found something like a Leyline Weaver is weirdly a better 2-drop, especially if somehow your Landwar Elves lives, maybe, or if you don't even have it, you have a Pollinator, but that doesn't work well. Pollinator typically always means you're playing Badgerimal Cub, but if you can get a Leyline Weaver online and you get it kind of activating, and say you play a 3rd land and you play a Weaver, you cast a Nature's Rhythm to go get a Badgerimal Cub, well, that untaps your Weaver, and then you play another Badgerimal Cub, and now you have a land, and next turn you have 2 Cubs, you have 9 mana, everything's popping off. That's because you kind of held the Badgerimal Cub a bit. But most of the time you're not going to. I'm just talking about the experience with the deck, and 9 times, not even, more than 9 times, 99 out of 100 times, you feel like you're going to play Badgerimal Cub on turn 2. There's just very rare scenarios where you might not want to, right? Like holding up the intrusion that you drew might be a better play. Getting a Keen Eye Curator when you're on the draw and play, when you're on the draw against like the Reanimator deck, right? So Keen Eye is going to be a good card to get down and establish and get good value. And sometimes playing this first, then playing a Badgerimal Cub, bringing up that land, using double green to exile both the threats, and then being aggressive with the Keen Eye Curator might be better, right? So it's always just weird, and you have to know your matchups. And something like dumping your hand also works well with Quantum Riddler. Like, when do you play the Riddler? Do you establish more stuff on the board, emptying your hand, so when you play Riddler, you're drawing 2 cards every time? Just making sure you know what to do. This is a bit more of a flex list, and this is the one that did really, really well. I think it's 1 or 2nd. Where were you? It's this one. This one's Simon Nielsen from the Magic Spotlight series. It got first place, going 15, 2, and 1. So this is definitely the kind of good, especially when you talk about best of 3. So again, is this deck going to just be able to do its thing and win very easily? Yes, that is kind of the obvious thing. I tend to think the same thing about Simic Omniscience, or like Bant Omniscience, which is kind of in one of those off-meta decks. You don't really see it too much because it's very vulnerable in the best of 1 curve to very fast decks early on, and you just get ran over sometimes. Or you play 1 card and it gets answered and then you die. But this is one of those decks that you can sometimes go Landward Elf, not get it answered, play a Badgerimal Cub, play an Ouroboros on the following turn with 3 creatures in play after you put a Weaver, and then you go get more stuff. And sometimes you can even Crater Hoof if you have a Landward Elf into a Badgerimal Cub into a couple of options. So like, it's just how much mana this deck can produce sometimes. And it's just really hard to kind of get it all contained and down to a perfect kind of rhythm, right? Nature's rhythm, you know, like a natural rhythm. But it's just sometimes I see people play it and they're still just kind of always going for that explosive turn. They're kind of always trying to do like the, oh, here's this plus this and go crazy. And then all of a sudden with their Badgerimal Cub trigger on the stack, Badgerimal Cub gets removed. They're like, well, now I don't really got anything to do. Then they don't play a second one. Then they end up rhythming for 1 to play Landward Elf. And they're like, well, if this lives, next turn I can Ouroboros. Well, then it gets removed. And they're like, okay, well, play a Badgerimal Cub, pass, I guess. Or play a Weaver and a Pollinator and pass. And then you're like, okay, cool. Do some stuff, right? It's very weird. I've just had a lot of things go either way. Obviously, in best of 1, sometimes you're going to get crushed no matter what you do, even if you play it perfectly. That's the nature of the game, and variance is involved. Your opponent can have a better hand than you, or can have a hand that just beats your hand, and there's not a lot you can do about it. But Badgerimal Variations is going to slide in at second, and then we're going to talk about the last one, which tends to ride the same wave as this, but has one crucial thing that I think is different that this deck struggles with, and it's about how you play it. So I guess I can just kind of click it. I don't really have to talk about it much. It's Reanimator. Reanimator is the best, in my opinion, to climb. 1, your games are very fast, so you can do it really quickly, right? So you can queue up. You can do nothing on turn 2. We've all played against this. It's happened to everyone. Where you mill over. Okay, you use a Dredger's Insight. It mills land. I don't know. Formidable Speaker. Mind Bitten. Bringer. Well, yeah, I'll take this back. That's fine. These are in the graveyard. Sweet. Turn 3. Cast Awaken. Blow up a thing. Turn 4, mill over. Oh, wow, it's an Ardent and an Overlord in the graveyard and a land. Okay, sweet. Nice. Play land. Bring back Bringer. Give everything haste. Bring the thing from your graveyard back and hit you with it. Okay, go ahead. Good luck. This deck avoids the did I play it right or did I play it wrong kind of thing that the Badgerimal Cub deck struggles with. This deck is kind of always all in. You're always going for it, right? You are playing Cash Grab on your opponent's end step. Your Dredger's Inciting on your turn. You're Town Greetering. You're Overlording for 2. You're playing the Speaker, discarding the Bringer, getting the Mind Bitten. That is typically the play every single time, right? Like, you're doing this every single time. The cards of choice that are hard is like Awaken the Honor Death. Do you want to do this? Do you want a Scholar, or do you want to do the Formidable Speaker because it might make your graveyard slightly worse? If your opponent has no permanent, this has to blow up itself, which is kind of funny. Because it says destroy target non-land permanent, doesn't specify opponent. So if this is the only thing on the board, you'll play it and then blow itself up. So it can weirdly be dead against like a control deck. The other thing is like if your opponent plays Rest in Peace, well, you have an out, and if you don't have the out, you get up and move on. You know what I mean? It just, this avoids everything that I feel like Simic kind of struggles with, and that is player error. I feel like you don't have many mistakes to make in this deck, and you kind of can always win on turn 4, right? Where Ouroboros oftentimes, because you rely on so many creatures, that even just getting the Land War Elf picked off in the beginning might not let you win turn 4, but then you have to do the math, and maybe it'll work. And then after doing that for, I don't know, 2 hours of playing, 3 hours of playing, are you still going to be as sharp? Where here, it just feels like, do I have 2 to 3 lands and ways to mill cards, and one of the combo pieces and one way to filter for it, or none of these pieces and just all good value? Like, a hand I could maybe explain here would just be something like this, right? Obviously this isn't a perfect hand, but the mana makes sense to do it this way. What if we have this, right? This is the opener. Great hand. We just play through these sewers on one. Play here. Play cash grab. I don't know. Grab this. Maybe it's the only thing that's good. Bringer's in the graveyard with a Formidable Speaker and another land. Play the Cavern. Name human. Play the Scholar. Maybe find the final land. Play Mindbit and win. Right? Like, that's oftentimes that's all it takes. And we've all been on the other side of where your opponent just high rolls you, or they go first, and it feels like you just never had a chance, right? Where your opponent hits the mill, and it's just everything that they would ever need, and you're just like, how do I beat that? And guess what? If you exile the Bringer, they Arden you. If you exile the Arden, you might get Bringered. The other thing is, this doesn't pick until it's resolving. So even if you have a spot removal exile, and they have 2 Bringers in play, right? And you say you have Cease and Desist or something, and they have a Bringer, Arden, and say another Bringer. Well, you have to exile the 2 Bringers because they probably have better stuff in their graveyard than you. And then they're just going to put in an Arden and bring back a Speaker that's a 5/5 now, and it's going to hit you with haste, and now you have to answer the board. And even if you do, there's probably got another Mind Bitten that might reanimate something else. And it's just so hard to kind of consistently deal with this, and I kind of always get there. I don't know where Terror of the Peaks is. Normally, you always play Terror. I think I might have copied the wrong list. I tend to play Terror. I can actually go grab the list since we're kind of talking about it a bit more. I think this is the last one I played. So this is kind of where I was at. So I played Bitter Triumph still, and this is what I climbed with, and I had pretty good success. Vibrance is in the side for some reason. I don't know. But I think let's just talk about the elementals and if they were good. But the thing about it, if you want to play a more complicated version, which definitely exists, that is maybe not this one, because this one's is it this one? Yeah, so here's like another one that's a little more complicated. It does have a lot more decision making and is a bit more removal heavy, but you get to play the Deceit and the Wistfulness along with your Reanimate plan. So it kind of gets the same benefit that Red has, where just because you know it's Reanimator, are they playing the elementals or not? And if they are playing them, which ones are they playing? Because they could play just Deceits, none of these. Playing all these, no Deceits if they really wanted to. Are they playing Awakening the Honored Dead? Who really knows? Are they on 4 of these? Or are they playing any of these? I've seen some lists play 1. I've seen some play 4. It's just such a hard deck to know exactly what's going on. There's no Terror of the Peaks in this list because you don't really need it, because you have stronger foundational cards. And Terror of the Peaks isn't necessarily needed as much, because sometimes you'll just cast the Deceit and be like, can you answer my 5/5? It's the old living end kind of issue, right? Or living in, sometimes you like exile your graveyard, and it's like, okay, can you beat my 5/5 with hexproof? And in Modern, oftentimes, no, you can't. It just is what it is. So this is the deck that I would recommend playing the most. And as you can kind of see, I have them all in here in off-meta decks. So off-meta auras, off-meta kind of deck like Mythic Mike plays, off-meta mono green, and then you have the... Oh, I didn't even talk about Jeskai Control. I put Jeskai Control at 3rd too, because it's the opposite at mono red. I forgot to talk about this. That sucks. But Jeskai controls third. The problem with it is your games go forever. I hate to do this at the end, but one, your games go forever, so that kind of sucks. But at the same time, you have good answers. You play Rest in Peace, things like that. None of you want to be told to play Jeskai control, let's be honest. I'll play Jeskai control. You really don't. There's some sicko out there like me that's like, Jeskai control, you say. And it's just like, they're probably not getting... Nobody's probably playing this, let's be honest. But people like me will play it. But that's the list I kind of have. There's obviously going to be other decks that you might be like, well, what about XYZ? As you can see, like, I have blue-black fairies here. I don't typically recommend playing this because mid-range is really hard to play, and it just struggles from, like, trying to keep up with some of the meta. When you're on the draw against Ouroboros, very hard to keep up, and it's just a little bit tough. As you can see, I have the Simic Omniscience list. This is the one that was doing really well, and I think this player fizzled out bad at that tournament. They were 9-0, and I don't remember even seeing them in the top 20, but I could be wrong. I don't know if you can switch decks or whatnot, so I'm not really sure. But another good off-meta deck is like this. The Izzet deck that kind of popped off by Jake, right? That I played it in best of one. It worked out pretty well, and maybe some iterations or changes would be good. So it's a bit weird, but with that, I hope you all enjoyed. This content is kind of new for me to make, so it's a little bit dysfunctional and kind of all over the place. It's a little bit of a last-minute kind of thing to do. I don't know when to quite make these videos and when not to make them. It's a bit weird for me, but these are a little bit more educational and kind of the thought process I go through, where I'm like, what deck do I just want to climb with today? And those are kind of the options that I settle with and why I settle with them when I choose to do that. So with that said, I hope you all enjoy, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.